Aloha, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I'm your host, SprinkleBeard. I stream on Twitch every day between 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today's video, you can already read the title, but it's a very heavily requested topic, and everybody has a different opinion on it. So we're going to talk about a vague understanding to help new players and free-to-play players understand whether or not a champion is good or is just food, right? How do we determine if a champion is good or food? So obviously legendaries would be a very easy, no, don't sacrifice them. They're almost never food. And a lot of players who have fed off a champion, like Mashallah at one point apparently used to be terrible. And then over time they changed and buffed his kit. And now he's a lot more usable. Right now I think he's a bit too powerful. But let's talk about what makes a champion like Mashallah very good, and somebody like Lord Champfort not as great, or not as commanding in presence. And then we'll go down to your rares, and we're going to be talking about whether or not you think a champion is good or not. We'll have some like very specific examples, and then we'll even do some of the uncommons and the commons in this video. So, what makes a champion good? At higher levels of play, one of the biggest things that we look for is how much it affects everything. So it might be attacks everyone, it might be debuffs everyone, it might be buffs everyone. So certain things like this will be a very big game changer. So on Mashallah here, we have Tornado. Places a 30% speed increase and a 30% crit damage increase on all allies. Then places a True Fear and a Leech debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. So this affects both parties, right? It affects my team and affects the enemy team, making this skill wildly good. What makes this skill stupid good, OP good, is that the turn for it is down to 3 turns, right? So if he's putting this on for 2 turns, this means by the time that he runs out, he gets this skill up again, and then it grants him an extra turn. So the extra turn, some players care more about than others. That is up to you. For the purpose of this video, though, again, we're just looking at how it helps the party, how it hinders the opponent. True Fear is considered like a hard CC, like a stun. The way Fear works in this game, basic Fear means that your champion has a 50-50 chance to either do their action or lose a turn, right? True Fear takes it a step farther, that if I clicked on Mashallah, let's say he's feared, True Feared, and I click on Open Wounds, that's my A3 with a 3-turn cooldown. If he gets the True Fear, he does not cast that, and it goes on cooldown. If he breaks through the fear, he gets through the debuff, and he fires off his Open Wounds. So this is one of the things that we look for when determining how good a player is, or how good a champion is. So now we're going to look at Lord Champfort. Now, Lord Champfort does have a skill that affects everybody on the enemy team, and it's quite good. Decreases attack and decreases accuracy. It places a 50%, meaning this is a 100% chance, making this skill actually quite good. However, the rest of his skill set is a little bit more on the selfish side. Attacks one enemy, has a 45% chance of placing a 60% decrease defense debuff. Because it's 45%, that's actually quite low on an A1. More standard is about 60%. You will see certain fluctuations because if it attacks more times, the percentage will be much lower because obviously you have 2 times of that chance to happen. But then he has a shield that can slow the opponent that gets put on him. I love this skill a whole lot. It's actually really useful in certain things like Doom Tower, or on certain, when you're clearing certain waves, it can be really great that if he takes the aggro, they will slow themselves attacking into it. However, there's just not enough in his kit. And because his Annihilation skill is a 45% chance, he would be kind of considered one of the worst legendaries right now. Not many people like him, not many people use him. I do really love his Earthshaker. Admittedly, I have a hard time working him into certain teams as well. So, if this is how we're judging legendaries, right, who have really powerful skill sets, really low cooldowns, or cooldowns that could get much lower, and some of their skills can help out quite a lot, right? This has a chance to stun all enemies, and it hits all enemies 2 times. Here she has a passive that whenever it's her turn, heals all allies by 10% of their HP, and randomly places a 30% speed boost on somebody. Sylve of the Drakes is one of the fan favorites right now. She is quite good as well. So it does depend on what is in the kit. Some kits are much more powerful than others. Some can be really amazing. And even a selfish kit, so like my Gensen here, he has a lot of things that increase his turn meter or reset his skills. So with that being said, he, even though he is selfish, because he's an attacker, there's times that can be a big benefit where he's just non-stop attacking. So let us get down to rare champions, right? So we just talked about what makes legendary champions really good or really bad. The same is going to kind of hold true for a lot of rare champions. The thing I want to stress with this video is this is completely subjective. There might be a rare champion where one player might tell you, hey, this is what you need on your account. You do not have an AoE defense drop on your account. So Fleshmonger, Mr. Pig, might be really good for your account. You also might have, all magic champions. So here, magic, tons of magic champions. So hey, it looks like you might need more force champions. Please understand that some of the conversations might lean in that direction. But what determines if a champion is just crap, right? Where it's like, you could use them, but are they really going to benefit you? No. Some of the times we look at the percentages of their skill. So here we're going to look at the Wretched. For the record, when I first started playing through this game on stream, I was doing a blind playthrough of the game. I used the crap out of the Wretched. He was very good for my account. So here he has an aura that only affects force allies, but in all battles by 30%. So that was a nice little thing for force champions. Admittedly, though, I didn't have many force champions. So his aura skill was like, okay, that's not good for me in most cases. Here he has an HP burn, and again, it's a place, so that means it's a 100%. So this was a great skill for my Wretch. It was nice to get the HP burn buff, debuff on my enemies. Let's look at the rest of his kit. Attacks one enemy, heals this champion by 15% of the damage. That's not bad. It's also not great, right? He heals himself by only 15%. Even if you built him right with a lot of attack, that will help him live longer. And it was a useful skill to have and use. It wasn't game-changing, though, right? This is not debuffing your enemy for all the rest of your party to do a lot of damage. This was not buffing the rest of your party. And last but not least, only 15% of the damage inflicted on an attack champion is quite low, right? It's not something that's going to sustain him like continuously every time it's his turn. Last but not least, attacks one enemy 2 times, has a 20% chance of placing a 50% heal reduction for 2 turns. Now, this chance can go up to 30% chance, but it's still very low. 30% is still low, and even if you say, well, he strikes 2 times, so it's technically a 60, that's not how the math really works out. Each chance is a 30% chance. It's still not a great kit. The last thing about this kit that makes it not great, there's not a lot of cohesion in his own kit, right? Like for an attack champion, he can HP burn, he can gain some life back, and he can heal reduce them. So I guess you could say between Crypt Touch and Life Leech, right? He's going to stop your opponents from healing, and he's going to be healing back up. And with Gravefire, it's nice that he can put an HP burn on. It's not enough, though, right? So let's look at a rare that, let's say, we would favor and say is really, really good. Let's look at Apothecary. I saw that I had a new level 1 Apothecary. His kit, by the way, he's a support kit. We will review another rare attack type champion that has great value. For the moment, though, we're going to focus on a support in comparison. Here we have increases ally defense in dungeons by 21%. That can be really good. Again, speed and accuracy right now are super meta. meaning the most effective tactic available in the game. But the fact that it increases all ally defense is very useful. So if you weren't using a speed aura, you're probably not using an accuracy aura. There's just not enough accuracy auras in the game on really good champions. You would probably end up using a defense. That would probably be the next best one to go with. So he has a decent defense aura for dungeons. Next here, he has a increased speed buff, and it's 30%, which is currently the highest speed buff in the game. But then he also fills the turn meter of all allies by 15%. This is on a 5-turn cooldown, but when he's fully booked, meaning you've upgraded all of his skills, this will reduce to a 3-turn. Here he has Soothing Chant. Heals a target ally by 35% of the HP, and here we have an additional 5, 10, 15%. I've heard, though, that it is multiplicative, right? So it's 5% of 35, and then 5% of that, and then 5% of that. So it's not true 50% from what I understand from talking with other players. But this heal can be critical, and the cooldown can go. So this can go down to a 2-turn. So every 3 turns, he's speed boosting for 2 turns, and then he's healing every other turn. As you can see, and the fact that this heal can be critical, so instead of him healing around 42%, 41%, somewhere in there, the fact that it can crit means that would be closer to an 80% heal on certain champions, which is really amazing. That especially, it's nice on certain characters like with Skullcrown, who constantly gets down to 1 HP and doesn't die, and then you could heal her right back up to 80% all the way back up would be great. His last skill is attacks 3 times at random. Obviously, this skill is not very impressive, but his other 2 skills and his aura are decent. His aura is decent. His other 2 skills, I would say, are great. This is one of the ways that we determine whether or not a champion is really, really good. So we compared Wretch, who was an attack type champion, to a support. Some of you might say that that's not fair. So a very easy comparison would be War Maiden. Now, I have to use a fully upgraded War Maiden that I have, just because I don't have a lower ranking one. But what makes War Maiden super great is that her Crumbling Blast here. Now, this is a skill that you do have to ascend. You need to get the 3 stars to ascend it. Otherwise, it's a 30% defense decrease. But it attacks all enemies with a really high chance of placing a debuff, and the debuff is the maximum debuff. For newer players, it's either 15 and 30, 30 and 60, or 25 and 50, right? That's going to sound really weird the longer you play the game, and we'll be showing off a lot of skills in this video. But in this case, it's either a 30% defense crack, if you will, and then a 60% defense break, if you will. So here, she can get this skill up to 100% chance for this to land. Now, 100% does not always mean it's going to land. It just means that every single turn that you do use the skill, it'll take your accuracy versus their resistance upon placing the debuff, which can be very, very useful. The rest of her kit is not bad, but because of how amazing this skill is, this is why War Maiden is considered really great. The other reason that makes her substantially great is that you can farm her in the campaign, just like this Diabolus. That's why I have so many Diabolus on my account. So you can upgrade her very easily, making her that much better. Some of the other rares that might have a comparable skill, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but let's say another rare had a defense down that had 100% chance. But if you can't farm the books for them, makes them a little less great. So like Fleshmonger actually would be a perfect example of that. He was the boar that we looked at a little bit sooner. A little bit earlier in the video. To review the rest of her kit, though, here she has Opportunity Strike, attacks 1 enemy, places a 50% attack increase versus a 25% attack increase. So this is the maximum attack increase on this champion, and places an extra hit if the attack is critical. The extra hit cannot be critical. Now, that's not as big of a deal as you think. It's still just extra damage that you're putting on, and then she self-buffs herself, which is quite great. This is on a 3-turn cooldown. her Crumbling Blast also gets to a 3-turn cooldown. So what happens is when you use Crumbling Blast and then use Opportunity Strike, before this attack increase ends, you do get off one last Crumbling Blast for maximum damage, which is great. The last skill that she has is attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing a 2.5% poison. So I forgot to go over that. The poisons in this game are 2.5% or 5%. So this is the weaker poison. That chance is really low, and as you can see down here, there's no upgrade for it. So unfortunately, her A1 is actually really weak. However, her A3 is just so amazing, it kind of does not matter. It really does not matter. She would still be considered good. The last thing you could consider is some of the base stats, how good her speed is, if she has any extra accuracy in her kit when ascended to 6-star. And the easiest way to do this would be to go into the index and to look at that champion rather than look at them like when they're like level 3, rank 3 and level 1. But here you can see their stats unaffected by anything else besides the fact that you have 6-starred them and fully ascended them. But 1300 attack is quite respectable. Around 1200 attack is, like, I would say, the average for attack champions. So for the fact that she has 1300, that means her attack stat's quite good. Her defensive stat is quite low, because just like we said, 1200 up here would be average. For defense champions, 1200 would be the average. So her having a really low defense stat does make her flimsy. Average speed right now is about 100 until they power creep things. So her being at 97, it's really not that bad. She's only a few off. But if she was at like 90 or 93, I would say she's slow. All right, so let's get back to talking about champions. Here I'm just going to hit my sparring pit real quick, because that bothers me if I do not hit it. So how do you determine if a random 3-star champion is good, is worth leveling up, is, worth your time and energy? So here I have 3 copies of this girl. Surely Miss Maiden must be good with her double hatchet and her actually decently stylish, armor set dress thing here. So again, one way that we could go into the index and look at her 6-starred and fully ascended to see where her stats lie. So she's an attack champion for the Sacred Order. So let's go do that. Sacred Order. She is an attack champion. Maiden. So, just like War Maiden, she has a decent attack stat. Her health, I know statistically, is really low. A much better stat would be around 1600 HP. But her defense is much higher. But here we can see her speed is abysmal at 87. So, right now, we are unimpressed with the stats. The only way you get better at the stats is just looking through the index at a bunch of different champions. Compare attack champions to attack champions. Compare defense to defense. Just be careful about that when looking through stats. Also understand that the skills could heavily influence why the stats are what they are. So War Maiden having really flimsy defense is because she has such an amazing A3. That could be a current balancing thing that if they gave her any more defense, she was just way too powerful with that A3. So let's look through Maiden skills. In all honesty, I don't know Maiden skills, so this will be a free review. Attacks one enemy. Places a 30% decreased defense for 2 turns. So 30% is the weaker version. We were hoping for a 60%. This is guaranteed, though. This is a 100% chance of this happening. So for that reason, kind of good. Places a 30% decreased defense buff on all enemies for 2 turns if this attack is critical. So this could be a good alternative, right? If you didn't need War Maiden to be Who's Force, and let's say you needed Spirit instead, she could be an alternative to an AoE defense down. Unfortunately, though, because this only attacks one enemy, it makes this skill far less impressive. Now, it's not necessarily fair to compare War Maiden to Maiden, right? They have different stats and they're different affinities. Their uses will be different. But from a more top-level player, again, we're looking at how it affects the whole field. Now, because this skill does affect the whole field, especially if it's just critical, that's a really easy condition to meet, especially on an attack champion. So this skill right now makes Maiden kind of good. And I'm going to say kind of good, like thumbs up keep, because if you got her in your early game, she would be worth keeping. Now, let's say you get to the point where you are 6-starring champions, and then you get her. At that point, no. I would say she's probably a feat at this point. The low stats overall, and then the A3, which is considered your champion's most powerful skill, being a little lackluster, just being a soft defense break, or defense crack as I will call it, it does not impress me enough. So that would be the reason I look at this. Likewise, 5 turns or eventually a 4-turn. 4-turn is kind of a long amount of time for consistency's sake, right? A lot of us higher end players, and I'm calling myself high end, I'm really in the mid game. A lot of us high end players, we look at the consistency of how well and how frequently that will happen. How dependable is it? You don't want a champion who's super amazing for the very first wave or the very first time they attack, and then they just drop off after that. But if you got her in the early game, would she be worth using? Absolutely. Like that's a very useful skill to get you through normal and maybe hard campaign. Next, her A2. Attacks 1 enemy. Decreases the target's maximum HP by 25% of the damage inflicted. This is actually really helpful on certain bosses that will heal up in the campaign. So I would say when you're in normal and hard campaign, her kit is actually really good for the campaign. Is it really good outside of the campaign? Probably not, unfortunately. Again, she might counter certain characters that heal in the arena, especially if you're having a hard time against healers. Decreasing their maximum HP is a way that you can get them in range to eventually be one-shot. It's not meta, though. Right now, decreasing HP is just a nice add-on. I don't see anybody using it consistently. It just seems like a nice bonus when it happens. But not something you look for, not something super dependable. And even on the bosses, right, that you can use that skill on, where it's very useful, there's really only one target in the Doom Tower where that's extremely useful on, and you would not be using Maiden for it. Now, if you needed something that stopped healers, or you were fighting that boss in the Doom Tower, who his name's Scarab. Scarab has a shield that doesn't break until you reduce his maximum HP. This would be a reason you might save her, right? You might say, oh, I need that for Doom Tower. I'm not going to sacrifice her right now. But if you're not doing Doom Tower and you're not worried about reducing maximum HP, that might not be a consideration that you might even use her. Last but not least, attacks 1 enemy, has a 25% chance, so that's real low, of placing a freeze debuff. Now, it's real low because it's a freeze. Certain things like freeze, stun, or sleep have a really low % chance of happening because it's kind of considered a hard CC. It's something where your opponent will lose a turn from being frozen. So 25% chance is actually pretty good for a freeze. Admittedly, though, it's still a low % chance for that to happen, right? It's a 1 in 4 chance for you to ever get that off. And then if you don't have enough accuracy on her, it's going to be harder. Overall, is she good or is she food, right? You might use her in Faction Wars because an AoE defense down might be useful in Faction Wars. Could you use her on Scarab while you're just, like, you're a new player and you're just getting into the Doom Tower? Yes, she could be an option. So for those 2 reasons, keep her, right? We're kind of in the middle here. Unfortunately, because of the low stats, that would be rule number 1, because of the kit not affecting your team enough or affecting the entire enemy team enough, it's a big turn off. Now, I will say this is a 100% chance for a soft defense debuff. This could make her like War Maiden, right? You could use her as a War Maiden. Her speed, though, is really low, so just be very aware that you'll have to focus on getting that speed up if you're going to use her in the arena. Overall, I would say she is food. Understand, though, she could still be made useful. For me, blindly picking a champion and looking at their kit, this is an example of a way for you to evaluate, is this champion good or not? We're going to look at a champion that I consider to be good, and I encourage a lot of players to use this champion. However, is he actually good or is he food? And the real answer is he is food. We're going to look at Berserker. So Berserker, you can farm him from the campaign. So admittedly, right there, that should also be an indicator. If you can farm him in the campaign, they're probably not a super amazing champion. War Maiden's just super amazing because of her AoE defense down. But we're going to review Berserker blindly, the way that we reviewed Maiden. And we're going to talk about why I like Berserker, and I would tell players not to feed him off. But I would also say there's times where you might get Soulbindbower, or Bowyer, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And I would say the moment you get her, he loses a lot of usefulness, because I think her kit is just a lot more useful. So we'll compare these two back to back real quick. So Berserker, when we get up to full stats, he has a decent attack stat, he has a decent speed stat, and a slightly less HP stat. So overall, he's already in a good place, or a much better place, compared to Maiden, and both of these are attack champions, right? Now, Maiden did have an AoE defense down, so let's see how his kit, Berserker, compares to that of Maiden. Attacks all enemies 2 times. Will ignore 20% of each target's defense. That skill alone is actually quite good. It's a shame that it does not have a debuff on it. Like, you know, that it doesn't break each target's defense. But the fact that he just ignores defense, and the fact that he's a spirit champion, meaning he counters force. More force champions are more focused on the defensive end of things. Makes him a bit better to attack into something like that. The fact that it hits all enemies 2 times actually means that he could be either a good farmer. I would not use him as your campaign farmer, but he might help you get through normal and hard pretty easily, or he might be a good spirit champion that you could just farm up and would be good for when you need a spirit champion that deals damage until you get a lucky champion from a mystery shard, or, you know, from any of the other shards, right? Next, let's look at his A2. Attacks 1 enemy. Grants an extra turn if the target is killed. This skill is technically considered bad. I do like this skill, especially when you're in the campaign. There's so many times where you leave somebody with a sliver of health, or in the arena, there's times where another champion leaves somebody with a sliver of health. I like this for, you know, kill a target, gains an extra turn. I love skills like that in this game. Is it super useful? No, it is not. This is also what I would consider something where if you need it, right, that makes him a good champion. If you don't need it, right, if you have like a bunch of other AoE clear champions, so you don't need this like last little peck, you're just trying to make all AoE clear, it makes this skill real bad then. And the fact that it's on an A2, right? An A2, we're hoping for buffs and debuffs, or like extra damage, or ignoring armor and stuff like that, right? So unfortunately, this skill, not as impressive. It would be nicer if it had better scaling on it. So like, let's say 5, 10, 15%, or was on a lower cooldown, right? So you could activate it more frequently. 3 turns isn't bad. It's just not impressive. Last but not least, attacks 1 enemy. Fills this champion's turn meter by 30% if this attack is critical. So in another video, I did talk about filling your own turn meter is actually quite useful, especially on an attack champion. That just lets him attack that much faster. What's kind of a shame about this is you would almost want to use your A1 instead of your A2. And that's a really bad thought to have, right? When your A2 becomes much more situational, and your A2 will do more damage than your A1. In almost every case, it'll probably do more. But the fact that this would fill up his turn meter 30% faster, meaning you would get back to this skill that much faster. That's not a bad thing for an attack champion. Honestly, that's where you would have wanted the grants an extra turn available. Maybe has a 60% chance of putting on a debuff, or gives him a buff if he kills a champion. Something like that would have been much better. So, how do we feel about this champion? Is he good or is he food? For most purposes, he's probably food, to be honest. He's got 1 skill that is really good. This means you could use him. You could use him and build him, and he will be fine. You could even take him to 60 because his stats are just close enough in a lot of categories to being good or average. My average, my self-imposed average. of stats of 1600, 1200, 1200, and 100. But in most cases, if a player asks me, do I need Berserker or is he food? I would tell most players he's probably food. If you need a spirit champion, if you need one that can do AoE attacks, or let's say you're working on a dungeon and you're just really hurting for spirit champions, you could go farm him and fully book him really easily. I do like him. What's the other big advantage is he's in the same area as War Maiden, so you could farm these two champions to give your account really good balance. So let's say you started off with Kale, right? You start off with Kale and you're looking for one of each affinity. You could farm War Maiden and you could farm Berserker at the same time. And then if you're trying to fully book the two of these, because you're using all your books on Kale, you would have a very well-balanced party to get you through the rest of the game. Do I think this is the best, most effective attack, most effective tactic available? No, he probably would not be the best. And because his stats are kind of in the middle of the road, he wouldn't take you super far. So I said we're going to compare him to Soulbindbower, and then we're going to go into some of the uncommons, and then eventually even the commons. Soulbindbower, right? Soulbindbower has a kit that I think is stupid amazing. Apparently she was actually nerfed at one point, which is a shame because her kit is in such a good place. Her kit to me is the prime example of, you will see how good her kit is compared to some of the other kits that we just reviewed. This is what makes the difference between a champion being really amazing, like Apothecary. It's going to do its job, do it consistently. Every single skill is quite good, except for one. But compared to some of the other champions we've reviewed that are kind of middle. So War Maiden is considered a must-have because she has that 60% defense break. But if she did not have that, or if that was 30%, War Maiden would drop in usage significantly. So let's talk about Soulbindbower. First of all, if you get her in the early game, she's going to be stupid amazing. Increases ally crit rate. So when you're at the beginning of the game and you're struggling to get your characters, your attack champions to 100% crit rate, having an additional 12% from your leader is going to be stupidly amazing. Obviously, the farther you get into the game, this passive becomes less and less useful to you. There are still some times where you might use it, or you might have a team where you just don't have a better aura. So giving all your tanks and stuff, or all your supports, an extra 12% chance to crit could help you win the fight, right? So let's look at A3, because A3 is supposed to be your most powerful skill. Attacks one enemy. So attacking one enemy right there, I'm going to click off of it for a moment, would be considered a bad skill on an A3. So this A3 needs to do something stupendous for it only attacking one enemy. So like with Maiden, the fact that if she crits, it could spread a defense debuff to everybody, made that skill actually pretty good. But it's not great by endgame standards, right? So let's look. Why do I think she's amazing? First of all, has an additional 25% chance to crit. So if she was your lead, right, she would be at 27% chance to crit. With this skill, she would be at 52% chance to crit. So that's amazing. She's kind of building her own kit, her own gear, which could be massively helpful when you start off the game. And then last, also has a 75% chance, eventually 100% chance, of fully depleting the target's turn meter. So we might have to do our own video on a target's turn meter. The super quick version of why this skill is great is under every character's health bar is the turn meter. As that fills up to 100%, that dictates when that character will go. So whoever reaches the full bar first would go first, and then every character after them would go. What you can do to be kind of cheesy is, let's say Apothecary is on the enemy team, and your Soulbound, both are getting that yellow bar up to full, and your Soulbindbower, for some weird reason, is faster than the Apothecary. So she gets to go first, but you see that the Apothecary's bar is also full, right? So he is going to go next. You could take this skill, fire, and hit him, and as long as he doesn't resist it, you get it up to this 100% chance, and then you have a higher accuracy than he does resistance, and the rolls work out in your favor. You could deplete his bar 100%. Fully deplete his bar. This means even though he had a full bar and it was his turn next, you can deplete that bar down to 0. What also makes this skill amazing is there are certain bosses like Ice Golem, like Fire Knight, who are subject to turn meter burn. So you can also deplete their turn meter, stopping them from ever having a turn. And since this is on a 5-turn cooldown or eventually a 4-turn, there's a lot of good from this. The only thing bad about this skill is that it requires so many books to make it really good. So she is book heavy, which is the thing that's bringing her down. HP, her HP stat is low. Her attack stat is good. Defense, respectable. Speed, it's not 100, but it's close, so it's not bad. And then the rest of the stats for rare champions don't really change that much, so we're not going to compare those. Let's go on to her A2. Attacks one enemy. So again, not great, but has an additional 25% chance of inflicting a critical hit, making her a lot better now. Will ignore 75% of the target's defense. This makes her really good. So now 2 of her skills in her kit have additional crit chance, and then 2 of her single target stuff, either depletes the target's turn meter or ignores their defense and a lot of their defense. And again, because she's Spirit, attacking force champions that are more defensive inclined means that she's going to hit them a lot harder. Last but not least, her A1 attacks all enemies and has a 25% chance of inflicting a critical hit. So notice a theme here that everything in her kit increases her crit hit chance. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. Now, because she requires so many books, we do say she's a scholar, right? She requires a lot of books to get fully learned. But if you got Soulbindbower and if you don't mind her aesthetic, I like the way she looks. I don't like her color palette. I really wish that they made her color palette a little bit better. The perfectly red circles on her face, I think, is the biggest offensive thing. I'm not a fan of the tan and gold together, but I think she looks cool. Her animations are not bad. Her kit is amazing, though. Her kit is absolutely phenomenal. So, I hope this helps a little bit. We can click on some random champions. So let's say Tigersoul here, who is a recolor. This looks a lot more appealing to me. I would have been much better. I would have been much happier if Soulbound looked like this. This color scheme's a lot better. But if we look at her kit, she has a buff that only works on herself. We at higher end don't like buffs that only work on one person unless they grant an extra turn. And because she's an attack champion with a defensive and block debuff, this skill is actually really good. It just doesn't make sense on her. Attacks one enemy, has a 75% chance of placing a weaken. This isn't a terrible skill, a 75% or eventually 100% chance. Weaken is like an upgraded form of a defense break. It causes the enemy to take a lot more damage, and it's very useful at high-end play of when you want to kill a boss, right? Bosses with enormous health pools. Weaken is almost a guaranteed necessity to help you chew through how much HP they have. This skill is not too bad, right? Attacking one enemy. This skill is kind of weird on an attack champion, and it makes her attack stat, and she has a good attack stat, kind of go to waste. 1,000 defense is really good on an attack champion, but her HP pool is quite low, so take it with a grain of salt. Her last skill has a 40% chance or 50 and then 60% chance of placing a better poison, so that's at least good. Unfortunately, her stats are just kind of weird for what her kit does. She's supposed to kind of be a boss killer, so she might be better. She could be good again if you needed a spirit champion that can kill a boss. Having a weaken and a poison in her kit would help. Unfortunately, though, there's just a lot of better champions, so I would consider her just food. It does depend, though. Please do not feed off a champion. If you get Tigersoul as your first rare, she would probably be worth building, and she will probably be very good for you. That's something in this game you really need to work with, and on my streams, I really preach every day you are making lemonade from lemons, right? You will get lemons like Tigersoul, and she might be the best spirit champion you have, make the best of her, and then when she gets outclassed by another champion, or when you get like an epic or a legendary that does her job a lot better, that's when you take that gear and switch it up to that next champion. There are certain champions though where their kits don't really make sense together. So I heard Jotun is a character that you can get, and he's an epic, right? Now his base stats are going to be better than any uncommon or rare. But we're going to quickly go through his kit because I don't want to make this video too long. I just did an enormous video right before this one. Let's go through this quickly, and then we'll move on to uncommons. I'm going to review the best uncommons real fast, and then, like, let's say 2 bad uncommons, and then we'll do the same thing for the commons. There's actually 1 or 2 commons that I would actually say are worth using or worth gearing. It does depend, though, because, again, it's one of those things. They're worth gearing until you get something better, and then you should absolutely move that gear from the common to a rare. Let's review Jotun here real quick. Jotun, I heard you can get for free if you use a referral code, right? From like a bigger streamer, or maybe from like one of your friends. I have not used a referral code personally, so I cannot attest to this. But if you do get him for free, let's look through his kit. Increases ally HP in faction crypts. So most new players do not do faction crypts. Faction crypts is considered like endgame content for most players. So that right there is not particularly useful. Stat-wise, he has 1600 HP, which is respectable. He's an HP champion, so that's good that he has more HP than any other stat. Defense, his defense is in a respectable place. Attack being close to 1000, good for a defense or an HP champion. His speed is a bit low, though. And then instead of getting extra crit damage, they gave him more resist, which is fine. Let's look at his kit now. Attacks 1 enemy. Decreases the target's max HP by 30% of the damage inflicted. Again, very situational when that's useful. In the campaign, that can be really good on certain bosses that heal themselves. It's not considered a great skill, though, overall. Damage increases by 50% if the target is under an HP burn effect. So that can be good, right? And it's on a 5-turn or a 4-turn cooldown eventually. And he has an HP burn in his kit, right? Say 2, attacks 1 enemy, has a 75% or eventually 100% chance to HP burn the target for 4 turns. This skill I actually do think is really good. I do really like this skill, and I like the fact that it does facilitate him to use Sear Away later, right? That you don't have to combo him with somebody else putting on an HP burn, or the dreaded, well, you have to use this skill first, hope that it HP burns, and then you're going to use your big swing. I will say that makes this A3 kind of bad, though, right? That in order to use his A3, his most powerful skill, you do need an HP burnout. Makes this skill a little less impressive. It's nice that he can facilitate it. It's not a huge deal that he's using his A2 first and then using his A3, but it is something of consideration. It's a reason we would judge it bad, right? Last but not least, attacks 1 enemy, has a 30% chance of decreasing their defense by 30%. So this is that soft defense break. It's not a great kit. It's not terrible. So eventually it moves up to a 40% chance. Again, I would like to see that at 60%. Would make this a bit more impressive. Or if the defensive break was 60%. If both were 60%, it would be a really good skill then. So as an HP champion, his goal is just to out-survive everybody else. It's not necessarily to do the most damage. It's like he's like a true tank in this, that I'm going to be a tank, I'm going to deal damage to you, and I'm just going to out-survive everybody. Compared to defense champions, where they more often offer protection and aid to their team. So what's good about his kit, he does have a way to self-facilitate extra damage. Unfortunately, the kit's just kind of in a weird position. It's not super reliable or dependable. Yes, his A3 is very dependable, and his A2 would be 100% when fully booked, but his stats are just not great. He's not a terrible champion. I would just warn you, I would not necessarily fully book him unless you love him like aesthetic wise, right? And you're like, nah, man, I'm all about the giant barbarian with the huge ass sword, and he looks cool. He kind of looks like a Viking. I don't know why he has horns, but I dig it. guys, don't let me tell you what to do. I'm giving advice based upon what I think. He would not be terrible. He would be a good boss killer. But because he's magic, and because you start off the game with 2 other magic champions, there's a bunch of reasons I don't think he would be a strong first character. Again, as an epic, he would be worth leveling up, and I'm not saying to feed him off, because you might need an HP burn. Doom Tower has a reason you need an HP burn. Clan Boss is weaker to HP burns, so he would be fine in your Clan Boss party. I'm not telling you to feed him away. I'm saying, though, compared to other epics who affect a lot more things and kind of do an HP burn job a bit better, he lacks a little bit of luster there. All right, so let's look at some of the uncommons, right? The game was actually kind enough that a lot of the best uncommons are actually all in the Sacred Order, so I'm not going to have to jump around too much. So let's talk about why certain uncommons are really good, and then how certain uncommons might not be great and they would be better off as food rather than not. So here we're going to look at Armiger. Armiger is actually considered one of the best uncommons in the game, and what's even funnier, I still use mine to this day. So he's a great champion, even if his stats are going to look a bit unimpressive. So he's a defensive champion, so it's nice that he has a bigger HP pool. It's a shame he does not have a bigger defense stat. It does not matter, though, when we go to look at his kit. His attack stat is a bit low, his speed is a bit low, and he has no extra, crit damage or resistance or accuracy. So unfortunately, his total stats, a bit unimpressive. Why is he considered top rate then? It's because of his kit. His kit is way overloaded for an uncommon. It's actually better than some rare champions. So if you got an Armiger, should you build him right off the bat? The answer is actually no. So because he's a defense champion, they're kind of difficult to build right off the get-go. Getting your defensive stat on him to be enough for him to consistently tank. And also when you're fighting on normal and hard, your opponents don't have a big enough HP pool for him to be really impressive. He's actually kind of like an endgame character. Now, what I'm saying, though, is that if you get him, you should keep at least 1 copy of him. If you get multiple copies of him, I would start feeding those multiples to him because he's very useful in certain things like Spider. You can use him in Iron Golem or Fire Knight to deprive... Here, let's look at the kit. Let's look at the kit to better explain this. Attacks 1 enemy, so obviously that's not great. Enemy kills by this skill cannot be revived. This can be extremely useful in things like the arena or Doom Tower when constantly things are reviving each other, or Ice Golem will revive his little minions. This is a very good skill for that. The thing that makes this super amazing, though, is damage is based on his defense, Armiger's defense, and the enemy maximum HP. So when you get to higher levels, there's times where he's hitting Clan Boss for 45,000 damage on easy, right? 45,000 damage is 3 times his own HP. It's more damage than most of your champions can even put out in the early game. Once you get to late game, you start doing attack ups, defense downs, weakens. You probably have a bunch of investments in attack percentage. You have your crit rate, your crit damage high. That's when you're hitting for 22, 45,000 range, right? He's doing this just because your boss has so much HP. That makes this skill really great. The fact that if you kill somebody with it, you get rewarded to stop a revive, or if it's just a good boss killing tool. It's also on a really low cooldown, so it makes Armiger quite impressive for that. The other skill that he has attacks 1 enemy, and it's an A1, so A1s be more gentle with your judgment. But again, 100% chance to decreases the turn meter by 30% if this attack is critical. So if he gets a critical strike on your opponent and their turn meter can be affected, you can lock certain enemies like Fire Knight, Ice Golem, Spider Queen out of their attacks by just continuously hitting them with their A1s if you build up his crit rate. Again, while you're at the beginning of the game, getting that crit rate to 100% can be very hard, which again makes him a lot less impressive in that early game, but in end game stats, right? Getting 100% crit rate is very easy for us to do. Hitting big bosses that are giant health sponges for an attack that goes off of their maximum HP is quite impressive. The other really amazing character for a very specific reason for uncommons is Outlaw Monk. Now, his stats are not impressive. Across the entire board, nothing about his stats are impressive. I guess you could say his attack is not bad. However, the reason that you'll use him is clan boss or as a boss killer. And the big reason why here is places 2 5% poison debuffs on the target for 2 turns. So if you put this on a boss, you are going to be effectively reducing that boss's health by 20% of its maximum HP. And then the thing we want to stress is that's on a 4-turn or eventually on a 3-turn cooldown. His other skill is attacks one enemy, and he just has a chance to grant an extra turn just by attacking. So when you go to attack a boss or to attack clan boss, which is where he's most commonly used, again, that's more once you're getting characters to maximum levels, or like, let's say you're getting all your characters to 40, that's where Outlaw Monk can be great. Again, I have a video on clan boss, and we talk about how poisoners are much more effective on clan boss. These poisons will probably outdamage a lot of your other characters. So unless you picked Kale, Outlaw Monk will probably outdamage, even if you had the other 3. Let's say you had Gallic, Elhain, and Aethel. Outlaw Monk will probably outdamage them, especially if you have his accuracy high enough so that he's consistently landing this, his poison debuff on the boss. So this is an example of where a character can be very specifically useful, but, you know, what about just overall useful? Here we're going to either look at Sergeant or Crusader, and I believe Crusader, no matter what, I've seen every account use Crusader. I think you get him for beating 1-3 or 1-4. Crusader is considered a really good champion for the early game. So HP is respectable, attack would be respectable, speed is a bit low, defense isn't bad though. But the big reason everybody uses him is that this is a fun skill to use when you just start off the game. Attacks one enemy with one random ally. The ally joining the attack uses their default skill. So if you picked, we're going to use Kale as an example, his A1 is a poison. So he attacks, he does a good chunk of damage, and then he can place a poison on the enemy. So if you use him, and just Crusader, if that's the only 2 men in your party, well, when you go to use this random ally attack, as long as your Kale is alive or not frozen in fear, there's situations, but as long as Kale can attack, the 2 of these people will attack. So he'll run up and attack, and Kale will attack, kind of dealing double the damage to that single character. Then his A1 is attacks one enemy 2 times. When you're at the very beginning of the game, that is considered a good skill. Now, let's look at some characters who would be a bit underwhelming in the early game. So let's look at Vigilante here. I'm not actually familiar with what Vigilante does, but he's an HP champion. So HP and defense champions would be really hard to build in the early game. His attack and defense are much lower than that 1,000 that I would like to see. His speed is at least respectable. So let's look at what he can do. Attacks 3 times at random. Each hit has a 50% chance of placing a weaken. Now, honestly, that weaken debuff is not bad, especially attacking 3 times at a 50% or eventually a 65% chance. That's not actually that terrible of a skill. So he would be an okay spirit when you're just starting off the game if you wanted to use. Attacks one enemy 2 times. So again, just like Crusader, his kit is not too bad. What would be good about him is that when you're getting anything that's like flat HP or HP percentage, you could put on him to make him a bit better. So in all honesty, he's not terrible. But is he good, right? Would he be good on like any team comp? And that is your real difference between your better play, like your top tier players, veteran players, let's say, and your newer players, is that if it's not consistent enough, which 65% is quite low. I also think that a lot of the enemies you fight a weaken in the normal and hard campaign, it probably wouldn't be too noticeable. What would be good, where you could use them to great avail, is killing off certain bosses. So if you're fighting a force boss, this attacks 3 times at random, getting that force boss by himself, this could be good to also weaken him. If you also use like a defense down, you would be able to steamroll over certain bosses quite easily. So the kit's not terrible, it's just not great. Let's look at somebody else, right? How do I know if... oops, I wanted lizard. I'm sorry. I have a goal here. How do I know if I want to use hard scale or Skinner, right? Or Soros. So Soros here, we're going to just skip over his stats. He has a decent attack stat. We'll note the positive of him, right? His A2 is attacks all enemies 2 times. That is great. Has a 10% chance, that's super low, of placing a heal reduction debuff for 1 turn. Places a 50% heal reduction debuff if the target's HP is less than or equal to 40%. So there is a guarantee in that later, so it's consistent. That makes Soros really amazing. Now let's look at the other reason he's amazing. Attacks all enemies. So as a spirit, to get you through normal and hard, Soros can be an amazing tool, especially if you get extra copies of him, right? You can feed him to himself to upgrade these skills, to upgrade the damage. That would be terrific. However, how do we know, like, if Stalker, right? Is Stalker any good? He's an HP champion. HP stat is respectable. Defense is close to 1,000, so that's not bad. Attacks 1 enemies 2 times. Has a 15% chance of decreasing the attack. That is really low. 15%, and then it's also a soft attack break. It's not that 50% us higher-end players would like to see. Attacks 1 enemy, heals this champion for 10% of the damage. It's not bad. It's not great. Especially as well because he's an HP champion. Now, healing himself for 15% of the damage is good. And again, we did mention that his HP and his defense are in good places. He wouldn't be very dependable. Again, building... The reason we don't encourage HP and defense champions is in normal, so many of your enemies don't have the resistance to stop debuffs, as well as they don't have the defense to take a lot of blows, even the defensive champions. So majority of us veteran players would just encourage you, use attack champions and steamroll through normal. And then when you get to hard, if you keep up with equipment, you could steamroll through hard pretty easily as well. Maybe some of the bosses you might have to play a little bit more tactical. But Skinner is actually considered a bad champion, but he has a really good use I want to point out. All of his stats are not too impressive. His attack is decent, so for an attack champion, that's good. His speed is real low, though. Here his A2 is attacks 1 enemy, removes 2 random buffs from the target. So again, that's a 100% chance. You still need some accuracy on him for it. The big thing, though, is there's a dungeon where you fight a boss that is all about buffing himself over and over, or herself over and over again. Skinner is one of your first easy answers for that. So even though Skinner would be an easy way to consider food, understand every single champion in this game might be good into a certain boss or a certain thing. Just depends on what you need and, you know, what you don't need. Certain champions like Lamore, who's an HP champion, he places bombs, and bombs do a quite of an impressive amount of damage in this game. And he's got a 60% chance, or eventually a 75% chance of landing. Is he good? For HP, he's got an impressive HP champion stat for an uncommon. Unfortunately, the rest of his stats are kind of low, a lower end speed, attacks an enemy 2 times. Again, it's one of those things. Bombs, also, you have to wait for 3 turns for that bomb to detonate. He would be considered really slow and normal, and that would not be very dependable. So for that reason, most players would consider him food. So unless you're doing like a challenge run and you're like, I only want to use demons and undead, nah, he would not be great. So overall, how would we determine if a champion is good or is food, right? It kind of depends on a few factors. You might look at their stats and determine whether or not a champion is good. And I would encourage you to do this in the index, not here. Because here we can see he only has 88 speed. When you get him to 6-star, he might be considered good then. He might have a higher speed stat. But when you look through his skills, how much he can affect a bunch of different things, right? So heals the ally with the lowest HP by 25%, then equalizes the HP of all allies. That could be really good if you understand how the equalization process works. If you don't understand how the equalization process works, you might accidentally kill all your champions that don't have a great HP or defense stat to equalize HP with. Turn the Tide, attacks one enemy, steals 2 random buffs from the target. Again, if you need somebody for that that magic dungeon or somebody that steals buffs, he could be really good. Do you always need somebody that steals 2 random buffs? No. So for that reason, it is up to you whether or not you think he is good. Attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing a block block buffs for 2 turns. This can be a good way against certain things as well. So to be honest with you, he would be really good for a single potion dungeon. But if you already have other force attackers like War Maiden and let's say Zargawa, you might not ever need him. Trying to steal the random buffs might be too difficult or not worth it. He's kind of like an upgraded Skinner in my opinion, but he's support. It does depend on what you need. So unfortunately, when you ask somebody for advice, you do need to tell them, hey, this is what I'm working on. Or you might say, hey, he's a buff stealer and I don't have any other buff stealers. If that's the case, you might want to save him for that blue potion dungeon. Just like the Wretch who I mentioned earlier, he has an anti-heal in his kit. Now, the problem is, though, the healer in the healing dungeons is Spirit Affinity. So taking Wretch in there, you need a butt ton of accuracy, and his heal reduction is not dependable here, whereas Soros's becomes more dependable if you can get the boss's health low enough first. So it does depend on what you're trying to do, what you are trying to accomplish. What I would encourage you to do, read through the champion skills, see if you like them or if you have a use for them, is the best way to answer. I could look through this and I could say this entire line right here does not have a single good champion on it. You can absolutely just sack this entire line here and nobody would bat an eye. I could probably do the same thing for this second line. Because these two are fusion materials, they slightly go up in priority. Does that make any of these champions bad? No. Coffin Smasher is actually considered amazing for clan boss. Decreases the damage inflicted by AoE attacks by 5%. Clan boss, dragon, ice golem, fire knight, all of them have AoE attacks. The blue dungeon has AoE attacks. Actually, all the dungeons have AoE attacks now that I think about it. So he's actually 5% better in any dungeon you take him into, or any boss you take him into. Has a chance to put an HP burn on, and that becomes a 75% chance. So that's not bad. It's unfortunately not 100%, but the cooldown's not too bad. Last but not least, attacks one enemy 3 times. Each hit has a 15% chance to go from 25% to 50% decrease attack. That's very impressive, especially when fighting a boss, right? If you can fight a boss and decrease their attack, that's amazing. Last but not least, Coffin Smasher is an HP champion. So again, here looking at his 3-star stats, that's not an impressive HP pool. So let's go to the index real quick and then we'll end the video. Whether or not that's good, 21,000. He has a very impressive HP pool stat. He is a bit on the slow side. His armor's a little bit lower than I would like. The point, though, is every champion in this game probably does have a specific use. The creators of Plarium probably designed every champion to actually have some good use or be good if you pull them as your first, like, rare or your first uncommon, right? The difference, though, is... Oh, actually, we forgot to review common champions. Let's do that real quick. There is a common champion of note that is considered better than all the rest, and it is Sister Militant. Her attack stat is low, her HP is low, her HP and defense are low. Her speed is respectable, though. Nearly 100 is actually quite good. So why is she considered the best Grey? attacks all enemies. So if you pull her as your first gray, she actually could be worth you leveling her up and even ranking her up to around like level 40. And she's perfectly fine to help you clear the normal and the hard campaigns. I actually technically put her in, like when I'm helping out newer players, so like my significant other, she started playing this game, I put Sister Militant in a counterattack set that you get week 2. I don't think it's the best use for Sister Militant, but it's working. It's working quite well. So whenever she counterattacks, she just attacks everybody. Her stats are low, and again, she's in a common champion, so we do not expect her stats to be quite great. Let's look at another attack champion, right? HP is low, attack stat a little bit better, speed is abysmal though. Attacks one enemy, has a 10% chance, so that's so low, of cracking the defense instead of breaking the defense. It only goes up to a 15% chance. Unfortunately, that's just not impressive enough on its own. Next, better HP stat and a decent speed stat, not too terrible. Attacks one enemy, has a 20% chance of inflicting a critical hit. So actually that's not too bad, but damage inflicted is proportional to defense. Unfortunately, again, defensive champions are really hard to build at the early game. You'd have to give him a lot of either flat or defense percentage gear with a substat of like flat defense. It's more trouble than it's worth for you in the early game to build up a defensive champion. The other champion of note that I said that is kind of funny that if you wanted to build up, you could, as a gray, is actually Death Knight. So we see Death Knight in all the commercials for Raid. What makes him good, he actually has a passive. Has a 30% chance of counterattacking when hit. Now, this does not mean that if you stack him with the counterattack stat set, that you have like a 75% chance. Like each thing has a chance of proccing, and they can't proc together. So you wouldn't want to necessarily team them up. But he does have a higher HP stat, which is kind of impressive. His speed is not bad. And then his A1 is a 15% chance to place asleep, and that goes up to a 30% chance. 35% chance. So that's actually not bad, because sleep can be considered a hard CC in this game. So it's kind of funny. He actually has some potential in this game to be a gray that you would build up. A lot of the other champions, like let's say you like the dogs, unfortunately, some of them, you would have to build them a very specific way. And as you can see, their defense is super abysmal. And then like sometimes like their damage is based on their defense. That's really weird on an attack dog for a skill to scale off of the defense, which is unfortunate. Guys, I hope this video was helpful to you. I'm sorry it's not more cut and dry of just, yes, these champions are sacrificable no matter what, and these other champions are keepers no matter what. There are certain keepers in the rare column, so such as like Apothecary or Bellower and War Maiden are considered rares that under all circumstances you would keep. It's some things like that can be very cut and dry. Frozen Banshee is amazing in Clan Boss. There's certain things that you will say are amazing. Dune Strider, I actually used on my first playthrough, and her attack stat gets to be quite impressive as you get her up higher, and her speed's in a respectable place. Her skill set, I liked. Is it super amazing? No, it's not super amazing. But it is working with what you have and making the best of it. And at the time, I did not like Gallic, and I found her kit consistently better than Gallic's. So for that reason, for me, Gallic should have been food. I kept him because he was my starter, but Gallic I just stopped using altogether, and I used Dune Strider in place, and she did a great job for me. I liked her sword more than I liked Gallic's two little tiny axes on a starter champion. I hope this video is helpful to you guys. I know it's a little on the vague side. It does depend on how many champions you have. If you already have, let's say, a magic attacker who's kicking serious butt, Dune Strider will probably just be instantly food for you. I will say she's good in the healing dungeon as an anti-healer. And she can be good in Fire Knight by attacking 3 times. It's not the most consistent, though, so take with a grain of salt. Guys, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you have a great and wonderful day.